Hello, it's me. I've come to read to you, but not in person, unfortunately. Sorry, I'm shuffling about. I'm actually on about take 18 of this. Every time I sit down to do it, something goes wrong. And I've got a frog in my throat now. I don't know where that's come from. It's not COVID, it's just a frog in my throat. But I've got some water. Anyway, obviously I can't be there in person, but I'm doing this online for you. Just reading, this is probably more Key Stage 2, so Enterprise and Endeavour. Reading a snippet of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain, which is a classic and therefore ticks lots of boxes for Endeavour because it's adventures and it's a classic. Anyway, it's packed full of adventure, this book. There's all sorts the children in this book get up to. But in addition to being a classic and being an adventure book, we're particularly looking at the theme of trust to fit in with your Christian value. Excellent. Sorry. Anyway, when we join the book, we find that Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, who's his friend, and considerably in worse circumstances, doesn't have a particularly nice home life, whereas Tom Sawyer's quite well looked after. So they've snuck out in the middle of the night on an adventure. I can't remember what, but while they were out, they witnessed a murder. They saw one man kill another man. Injun Joe killed a doctor. And there was a third man who was there present called Muff Potter. And the two boys saw it. And when we pick up the story, they are running away, as you would expect. Then we're going to read the beginning of this chapter, chapter 10, and then we pick it up again in chapter 24 at the murder trial. It's very exciting. It's set in America, written in 1876, so it's quite old. And I'll try and do some American accents if my voice can hold out. Anyway, so they're running away from the scene. And I've got, can you see it? It's driving me bonkers. A little reflection in my specs. Yeah, I'm going to read like that so I can't see it. Right. On we go. The two boys flew on and on towards the village, speechless with horror. They glanced backward over their shoulders from time to time, apprehensively, as if they feared they might be followed. Every stump that started up in their path seemed a man and an enemy, and made them catch their breath. And as they sped by some outlying cottages that lay near the village, the barking of the aroused watchdogs seemed to give wings to their feet. "If only we can get to the old tannery before we break down," whispered Tom, in short catches between breaths. "I can't stand it much longer." Huckleberry's hard pantings were his only reply, and the boys fixed their eyes on the goal of their hopes and bent their work to win it. They gained steadily on it, and at last, breast to breast, they burst through the open door and fell, grateful and exhausted, into the sheltering shadows beyond. By and by their pulses slowed down, and Tom whispered, "Huckleberry, what do you reckon will come of this?" "If Dr. Robinson dies, I reckon hanging'll come of it." "Do you, though?" "Well, I know it, Tom." Tom thought a while and then said, "Who'll tell? We?" "What are you talking about? Suppose something happened and Injun Joe didn't hang. Why, he'd kill us sometime or other, just as dead sure as we're a lying here." "That's just what I was thinking to myself, Huck. If anybody tells, let Muff Potter do it. If he's fool enough, he's generally drunk enough." Tom said nothing, went on thinking. Presently he whispered, "Huck, Muff Potter don't know it. How can he tell?" "What's the reason he don't know it?" "Because he just got that whack when Injun Joe done it. Do you reckon he could see anything? Do you reckon he knowed anything?" "Ah, hokey, that's so, Tom. And besides, look a-here, maybe that whack done for him." "No, 'tain't likely, Tom. He had liquor in him, I could see that, and besides, he always has. Well, when Pap's full, you might take and belt him over the head with a church and you couldn't faze him. He says so his own self. So's the same with Muff Potter, of course. But if a man was dead sober, I reckon maybe that whack might just fetch him. I don't know. After another reflective silence, Tom said, Hooky, you sure you can keep Mum? Tom, we've got to keep Mum, you know that. That Injun devil wouldn't make any more drowning us than a couple of cats if we was to squeak about this and they didn't hang him. Now look a-here, Tom, let's take and swear to one another. That's what we got to do, swear to keep Mum. I'm agreed, Huck, that's the best thing. Would you just hold hands and swear that we... Oh, no, that wouldn't do for this. That's good enough for little rubbishy common things, especially with gals, 'cause they go back on you anyway and blab if they get in a huff. But this ought to be in writing about a big thing like this, and blood. Tom's whole being applauded the idea. It was deep and dark and awful. The hour, the circumstances, the surroundings were in keeping with it. He picked up a clean pine shingle that lay in the moonlight and took a little fragment of red keel out of his pocket, got the moon on his work and painfully scrawled these lines, emphasising each slow downstroke by clamping his tongue between his teeth and letting up the pressure on the upstrokes. Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer swears they will keep Mum about this. They wish they may drop down dead in their tracks if they ever tell, and rot. Huckleberry was filled with admiration at Tom's facility in writing and the sublimity of his language. He at once took a pin from his lapel and was going to prick his flesh, but Tom said, Hold on, don't do that. That pin's brass. It might have verdigris on it. What's verdigris? It's poison, that's what it is. You just swallow some of it once, you'll see. So Tom unwound the thread from one of his needles, and each boy pricked the ball of his thumb and squeezed out a drop of blood. In time, after many squeezes, Tom managed to sign his initials using the ball of his little finger for a pen, and he showed Huckleberry how to make an H and an F, and the oath was complete. They buried the shingle close to the wall, and with some dismal ceremonies and incantations, and the fetters that bound their tongues were considered to be locked, and the key thrown away. So they've run away. They've got into a shed, and they've decided that this is something they must never tell about, because if they do tell, perhaps Injun Joe the murderer will come and find them and kill them. So they never want to tell, and they put that into a promise. It's written and then signed in blood. They use the word oath, O-A-T-H, and that means a promise. And it's a written promise and to declare the solemnity and the severity of the situation that they find themselves in. And then lots happens, with lots of adventures in between. And it's the summer holidays, and all of a sudden the trial is upon them. And in the interim, Muff Potter has been arrested and held in jail, and he is suspected of having killed this doctor. And the only people that know any different are Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer. Chapter 24. At last the sleepy atmosphere was stirred, and vigorously. The murder trial came on in the court. It became the absorbing topic of the village talk immediately. Tom could not get away from it. Every reference to the murder sent a shudder to his heart. For his troubled conscience and his fears almost persuaded him that these remarks were put forth in his hearing as feelers. He did not see how he could be suspected of knowing anything about the murder, but still he could not be comfortable in the midst of the gossip. It kept him in a cold shiver all the time. He took Huck to a lonely place to have a talk with him. It would be some relief to unseal his tongue for a little while and divide his burden of distress with another sufferer. Moreover, he wanted to assure himself that Hook had remained discreet. "Hook, have you ever told anybody about that?" "About what?" "You know what." "Oh, of course I haven't." "Never a word?" "Never a solitary word, so help me. What makes you ask?" "Well, I was afeard." "Why, Tom Sawyer, we wouldn't be alive 2 days if that got found out. You know that." Tom felt more comfortable after a pause. "Hook, why, they couldn't anybody get you to tell, could they?" "Get me to tell? Why, if I wanted that half-breed devil to drown me, they could get me to tell. There ain't no different way." "Well, that's all right then. I reckon we're safe as long as we keep mum, but let's swear again anyway. It's more surer." "I'm agreed." So they swore again with dread solemnities. "What is the talk around, Hook? I've never heard power of it." "Talk? Well, it's just Muff Potter. Muff Potter all the time. It keeps me in a sweat. Constant. So I want to hide summers." "That's just the same way they go on around me. I reckon he's a goner. Do you feel sorry for him sometimes?" Most always. He ain't no account. But then he ain't never done anything to hurt anybody. Just fishes a little to get some money to get drunk on. And he loafs around considerable. But Lord, we all do that. Leastways most of us. Preachers and such like. But he's kind of good. He give me half a fish once, when there wasn't enough for two. And lots of times he's kind of stood by me when I was out of luck. Well, he mended kites for me, Huck, and knitted hooks on my line. I wish we could get him out of there." "My, we couldn't get him out, Tom, and besides, 'twouldn't do any good. They'd catch him again." "Yes, so they would, but I hate to hear him abuse himself like that, the dickens, when he's never done that." "I do too, Tom. Lord, I hear 'em say he's the bloodiest looking villain in this country, and they wonder he wasn't ever hung before." "Yes, they talk like that all the time. I've heard 'em say that if he was ever to get free, they'd lynch him." "And they'd do it too." The boys had a long talk, but it brought them little comfort. As twilight drew on, they found themselves hanging about the neighbourhood of the little isolated jail, perhaps with an undefined hope that something would happen that might clear away their difficulties, but nothing happened. There seemed to be no angels or fairies interested in this luckless captive. The boys did as they had often done before, went to the cell, grating, and gave Potter some tobacco and matches. He was on the ground floor, and there were no guards. His gratitude for their gifts had always smote their consciences before. It cut deeper than ever this time. They felt cowardly and treacherous to the last degree when Potter said, "You've been mighty good to me, boys, better than anyone else in town, and I don't forget it, I don't. Often I says to myself, says I used to mend the boys' kites and things, show 'em where the good fishing places was, and befriend 'em when I could. And now they've all forgot old Muff when he's in trouble, but Tom don't, and Huck don't. They don't forget him, says I, and I don't forget them. Well, boys, I done an awful thing, drunk and crazy at the time. That's the only way I can account for it. And now I got to swing for it. And it's right, and best, too, I reckon. Hope so. Anyway, well, we won't talk about that. I don't want to make you feel bad. You've befriended me. But what I want to say is, don't you ever get drunk, and you won't ever get here. Stand a little further west. So that's it. It's a prime comfort to see faces that's friendly when a body's in such a muck of trouble. And there don't none come here but yourn. Good friendly faces. Good friendly faces. Get up on one another's backs and let me touch 'em. That's it. Shake hands. Your'll come through the bars. Mine's too big. Little hands and weak. But they've helped Muff Potter a power, and they'd help him more if they could. Tom went home miserable, and his dreams that night were full of horrors. The next day and the day after, he hung about the courtroom, drawn by an almost irresistible impulse to go in, but forcing himself to stay out. Hook was having the same experience. They studiously avoided each other. Each wandered away from time to time, but the same dismal fascination always brought them back presently. Tom kept his ears open when idlers sauntered out of the courtroom, but invariably heard distressing news. The toils were closing more and more relentlessly around Potter, and at the end of the second day the village talk was to the effect that Injun Joe's evidence stood firm and unshaken, and that not the slightest question as to what the jury's verdict would be. Tom was out late that night. He came to bed through the window. He was in a tremendous state of excitement. It was hours before he got to sleep. All the village had flocked to the courthouse the next morning, for this was to be the great day. Both sexes were about equally represented in the packed audience. After a long wait, the jury filed in and took their places. Shortly afterwards, Potter, pale and haggard, timid and hopeless, was brought in with chains upon him and seated where all the curious eyes could stare at him. No less conspicuous was Injun Joe, solid as ever. There was another pause, and the judge arrived, and then the sheriff proclaimed the opening of court. The usual whisperings among the lawyers and gathering together of papers followed. These details accompanying delays worked up an atmosphere of preparation that was as impressive as it was fascinating. Now a witness was called who testified that he found Muff Potter washing in the brook at an early hour of the morning that the murder was discovered, and he immediately sneaked away. After some further question, counsel for the prosecution said, "Take the witness." The prisoner raised his eyes for a moment but dropped them again when his own counsel said, "I have no questions to ask him." The next witness proved the finding of the knife near the corpse. Counsel for the prosecution said, "Take the witness." "I have no questions to ask him," Potter's lawyer replied. And a third witness swore he had often seen the knife in Potter's prosecution. "Take the witness." Counsel for Potter declined to question him. The faces of the audience began to betray annoyance. Did the attorney mean to throw away his client's life without effort? Several witnesses deposed concerning Potter's guilty behaviour when brought to the scene of the murder. They were allowed to leave and stand without being cross-questioned. Every detail of the damaging circumstances that occurred in the graveyard upon that morning, which all present remembered so well, was brought out by credible witnesses, but none of them were cross-examined by Potter's lawyer. The perplexity and dissatisfaction of the House expressed itself in murmurs and provoked a reproof from the bench. Counsel for the prosecution now said, "By the oaths of citizens whose simple word is above suspicion, we have fastened this awful crime beyond all possibility of question upon the unhappy prisoner at the bar. We rest our case here." A groan escaped from poor Potter, and he put his face in his hands and rocked his body softly to and fro, while a painful silence reigned in the courtroom. Many men were moved, and many women's compassion testified itself in tears. Counsel for the defence rose and said, "Your Honour, in our remarks at the opening of this trial, we foreshadowed our purpose to prove that our client did this fearful deed while under the influence of a blind and irresponsible delirium produced by drink. We have changed our mind. We shall not offer that plea." Then to the clerk, "Call Tom Sawyer." A puzzled amazement awoke in every face in the house, not even excepting Potter's. Every eye fastened itself with a wondering interest upon Tom as he rose and took his place upon the stand. The boy looked wild enough, for he was badly scared. The oath was administered. "Thomas Sawyer, where were you on the 17th of June at about the hour of midnight?" Tom glanced at Injun Joe's face, and his tongue failed him. The audience listened breathless, but words refused to come. After a few moments, however, the boy got a little of his strength back and managed to put enough of it into his voice to make part of the house hear. In the graveyard. A bit louder, please. Don't be afraid. You were in the graveyard. A contemptuous smile flitted across Injun John's face. Were you anywhere near Horse William's grave? Yes, sir. Speak up just a trifle louder. How near were you? Near as I am to you? Were you hidden or not? I was hid. Where? Behind the elms that are on the edge of the grave? Injun Joe gave a barely perceptible start. Anyone with you? Yes, sir. I went there with... Wait a moment. Never mind mentioning your companion's name. We will produce him at the proper time. Did you carry anything there with you? Tom hesitated and looked confused. Speak out, my boy. Don't be diffident. The truth is always respectable. What did you take there? Tom began, hesitatingly at first, but as he warmed to his subject, his words flowed more and more easily. In a little while every sound ceased but his own voice, every eye fixed upon him. With parted lips and bated breath, the audience hung upon his words, taking no note of time, wrapped in ghastly fascinations of the tale. The strain upon the pent emotion reached its climax when the boy said, and as the doctor fetched the board around and Muff Potter fell, Injun Joe jumped with a knife and then Injun Joe runs out of the court, runs away. So what we've got here is two trust tracks, okay? We've got Huckleberry Finn and Tom, who have made a promise to one another never to tell about this thing that's happened. Let's take them off because then I haven't got that horrible reflection. Tom and Huckleberry Finn made a promise. They swore it in blood. They said those promises again. So they said them first in chapter 10 and then they said them again in chapter 24, although they didn't do the whole blood thing the second time around. They were genuinely quite frightened of telling the truth, and they trusted one another that they would keep this secret that neither would tell. Okay. And then clearly when we come to chapter 24 and we see them visiting Muff Potter and in prison before the trial's completed, they both clearly feel quite guilty about knowing something and what might happen to Potter if he's found guilty. And actually we find out that even Potter thinks he must be guilty. He doesn't really remember what happened that evening. Injun Joe has told everybody that it was Muff Potter that committed the crime and not himself. So he's told a massive lie, and everyone, but including Muff Potter, believes him. And the only people that know the truth are Tom and Huck. And they're very frightened because they're only children, and it would be a frightening thing for anybody to know something like that and to have carried that secret around, and then to realise what the impact of that secret might be. So you've got, on the one hand, you've got the trust between Huck and Tom, who swear never to tell what they know because they're frightened of what might happen if they do. And then you've got this other theme of trust, which is it's this trust that makes them both feel guilty, and it's this trust that pinches away at their at how they're feeling all the time, makes them feel guilty that they're keeping this secret. It taps away at their conscience. So ultimately, Tom tells the truth, and he tells the truth in court, and it's obviously quite a scary thing, and it would be for anyone, never mind any child. But ultimately, that is also a theme of trust, because as we live in a community, in our villages where we live, in our country, in our global community, we obviously have laws and rules, and we trust one another to follow them. And when people break those rules, it's a break of our trust as well. So as a community, whichever community it is that's appropriate, when somebody breaches the trust, we hold them to account. So if it's a criminal offence, they hopefully should go to court and be dealt with by the court. But equally, within communities, you find that people who make wrong choices or bad choices or choices that have a negative impact on the community as a whole will be held to account by the community. Am I speaking a bit posh? Probably am. What I'm actually saying is it's generally better to tell the truth. And I think we all know that. And we all know that lies can lead us into a place where there's greater difficulty. And we also have issues of trust. If somebody tells you not to tell anything, and this was a promise that they made to each other, so it's no question of one person forcing the other person to make a promise. That's not what's happened. They do it together. They're in it together. So it's a real mutual, that's two parties working together. It's a real, it's a pact. It's an oath. And has Tom broken it when he goes to court and tells the truth? To observe, in order to follow the trust of the community by telling the truth, has he thrown away the trust between him and Huck? In actual fact, he hasn't done. Kind of. They did promise not to tell anybody. And what Tom doesn't do is he doesn't tell on Huck. He never tells that Huck was there as well. He never has to. And so he is kind of the purpose of the promise between Huck and Tom was to make sure neither of them suffered any consequences because they'd seen what had happened. So even though he hasn't been able to keep the exact promise, the purpose of the promise is upheld because nobody knows Huck was there. And so Huck is safe from Injun Joe. So that's it really. Two big themes of trust, two big meaty issues. Meaty issues of trust. Promises with friends, promises to do things you probably shouldn't do, but he's your friend and you've both made that promise together. And then the promise we make is we're a member of a community, whether we're talking little community in school or a village or town, country, world. We trust one another in a general way to behave and not to commit crimes, not to pinch cars, not to do the wrong thing, and to live in a way that we can all live peacefully together. So yeah, probably rambled on quite long enough now about the themes of trust. But I really like those snippets. They are big issues that you might need to tweak away at the meanings of them, but you can see the conflict between the promise that we might make to a friend or to somebody close to us versus the promise that we make as a citizen to be a good citizen. And it might be an unspoken promise. We might not have signed our oaths in blood to be a good citizen, but nonetheless that is what's expected of us, and trust is something that we do expect of one another, I think. So take that away and have lots of fun with it. It's a brilliant book, by the way. You are more than capable of reading that book. It is filled with adventures like I would have loved to have had when not that particular bit of the adventure. I don't think I'd want that, but other stuff. It's loads of fun. Loads of fun. So it's a really good book. You quite often read it in high school, but it just says how much I think about your reading skills that I've read it to you. It is a children's book, even though you study it in high school. All right, that's it. I'm going to stop talking now. Speak to you soon. Bye.